Red Willow, Montana Territory. Winter, 1883. The wind that morning carried more dust than mercy. It rolled down from the iron-gray masses of the mountains like an old animal wheezing through its ribs, scattering ice crystals through the frozen alleys of Red Willow. It was a town built of exhaustion and timber, where the smell of wood smoke and wet wool clung to the planks. Men shouted louder than the horses, their breath pluming in white clouds, and silver coins clinked like the world's only prayer. Somewhere behind all of it came the dull rhythm of a hammer striking wood. The auction block was being tested for weight. They were selling again. Not cattle this time. Lynn stood barefoot on that frost-rimmed platform, the splinters biting into her soles until the blood dried black against the ice. Her wrists were bound in coarse hemp rope, the skin rubbed raw, the marks weeping from days of travel. She had not eaten since yesterday, though she no longer felt hunger, only the hollow calm that arrives when the body forgets it belongs to itself. The wind tangled her dark hair and lifted the torn hem of her traditional cheongsam. The silk, once a vibrant crimson meant for celebration, was now tatters of faded blood red, offering no defense against the American winter. Somewhere in the crowd, a man laughed. Another spat, the spittle freezing near her toes. She didn't flinch. Flinching only made them laugh louder. $2, a voice called out, muffled by a scarf. $3, another answered. $5 for the China doll. The auctioneer grinned, his face ruddy with cold and whiskey. He slapped the plank beside her shivering ankle. Come on, gents. She eats little, works hard. Make it worth my trouble. Lynn stared at the ground. Her name, the one her mother had whispered to her meaning forest jade, was a sound she had not heard in weeks. Here, she was not a name. She was only a price waiting to rise. 6, a man's voice said. It was not loud, but it was sharp enough to cut through the wind. Heads turned. He stood near the edge of the square, one boot resting against the hitching post, his heavy buffalo coat a shade between dust and ash. Garrett Thorne. His hair was dark and unruly, his face drawn tight around a scar that sliced from his jaw to his collarbone, a mark left long ago by a blade or a bullet. His left shoulder hung stiff, an old cavalry wound that had taught him how to live with pain quietly. He reached into his coat, took out $6 silver, and placed them on the rail. Untie her, he said. The crowd went quiet enough to hear the wind scrape across the roofs. The auctioneer hesitated, caught between greed and disbelief. Then greed won. Your loss, mister, he said, grabbing a knife from his belt. He sliced through the rope around her wrists. The fibers fell to the planks, coiling like dead snakes freed. Lynn swayed on her feet. The ground tilted, and for a breath, she thought she might fall into the snow. A hand appeared in front of her, rough, sun-browned, open. Not forcing, only offering. She hesitated. The hand stayed there, patient as stone. She took it. Garrett steadied her, then released her. Come on, 2 words, soft and spare. No command in them. No pity either, only motion. They stepped off the platform. Behind them, the crowd muttered, disappointed. The kind of men who could watch chains being sold like tobacco had little interest once mercy entered the price. The wind chased them through the narrow street, snow swirling around their boots. Garrett led her to the trough behind the feed store, where the water had crusted over with ice. He broke the surface with the handle of his knife and dipped a tin cup, setting it in her hands. Lynn hesitated, her throat working once before she lifted the cup, drinking too fast, water spilling down her chin. She coughed. Garrett took the cup, filled it again, and handed it back without a word. This time she drank slower. He pulled a folded blanket from his saddlebag, wool, grey, worn thin at the corners, and laid it over her shoulders, careful not to touch her skin. The blanket swallowed her frame, covering the tattered silk. She closed her eyes for a heartbeat, the first moment in months that warmth didn't come with a price. When she looked up again, he was already adjusting his saddle. Can you ride? He asked. She nodded, unsure. Then hold the horn. I'll keep you steady. He mounted first, then helped her up, guiding her gently onto the front of the saddle. His hand rested near her waist, not on it, just close enough to catch her if she slipped. She held the blanket tight and looked straight ahead as he turned the horse toward the road that led out of town. Behind them, the auctioneer's laughter echoed faintly through the wind. They rode for miles before either spoke again. Red Willow shrank behind them until it was only a smear of smoke against the white horizon. The land opened wide, frozen grass, low mesas, and a sky that seemed too big for mercy. The horses' hooves drummed steady against the packed snow. Garrett slowed the pace when he noticed the tremor in her shoulders. "Cold?" he asked. She didn't answer, only tightened the blanket. He shifted his heavy coat open enough to block the biting wind from her side. She noticed but said nothing. Gratitude was still a language she didn't trust. When the road curved toward the hills, he stopped by a patch of scrub oak. "Rest a minute," he said. He dismounted, then offered his hand again. She slipped down, light as a breath, and landed awkwardly, knees shaking. He steadied her elbow, then stepped back. She crouched, touched the snow with her fingertips, and held it there, pressing her palm flat. The soil beneath was frozen, hard as iron, but it was earth. Not the boards of a wagon floor, not the iron belly of a cage. Garrett watched without speaking. He took out his knife and cut the last length of rope still hanging from her wrist. Instead of tossing it away, he knelt, dug a small hole at the base of a rock, and buried it. Lynn watched him cover it with frozen dirt and pat the ground once, like a man sealing a grave. He didn't say what it meant. He didn't have to. When he looked up, her eyes met his for the first time. "Eat," he said, handing her a strip of jerky. She took it, bit carefully, chewing slow. He ate a smaller piece himself, standing guard without making it obvious. "Your name?" he asked after a while. She hesitated, tasting the English on her tongue like something sharp. "Lynn." He nodded. "Garrett Thorne." Their names hung between them, the first trade made freely that day. By dusk, the air turned colder. They followed a dry creek bed that led toward the distant outline of Garrett's ranch. The horizon blazed in copper light, and every shadow stretched long like a warning. When the cabin finally came into view, Lynn blinked as if unsure it was real. A small wooden house crouched near a split-rail fence, one corner of the roof sagging under the weight of accumulated snow. Smoke drifted thinly from the chimney. It wasn't much, but it stood, and it was quiet. Garrett dismounted, wincing as his shoulder caught. "Here," he said, motioning for her to wait. Then he offered his hand again for balance. As she climbed down, she touched it briefly, then pulled away, keeping distance. Inside, the cabin smelled of dry pine and old leather. A stove squatted near the far wall, still warm from the morning fire. There was one bed, a table with 2 chairs, and shelves lined with jars of beans and flour. Everything was neat, not polished, the kind of order that belonged to someone who'd learned how to live alone. "Sit," he said, pointing to the chair nearest the stove. She hesitated. He nodded once. She sat slowly. He ladled beans from a pot left on the stove into a tin bowl, set it before her, and stepped back. She stared at it, then at him. He leaned against the counter, arms folded. After a moment, she ate fast at first, then slower when she realized he wouldn't take it away. When the bowl was empty, he filled it again without asking. Her hands trembled less now. The firelight caught her cheekbones, sharp from hunger, and the bruises along her neck. Garrett saw but didn't ask. Some stories didn't need telling on the first night. He reached into a trunk near the bed, pulled out a clean flannel shirt and heavy wool trousers. "You can change. I'll check the barn." She waited until the door shut behind him before standing. The blanket slipped to her elbows as she lifted the shirt. It smelled of soap and smoke. She slipped it on, the hem falling nearly to her knees, and pulled on the trousers. The cabin's stillness pressed against her ears. No shouting. No chains clinking. Just the tick of cooling metal and the small crackle of wood. She exhaled for what felt like the first time. Outside, Garrett fed the horse and checked the corral. Mercy, he'd learned, was best given space to breathe. When he returned, she was sitting again, straighter this time. He added another log to the stove. "I'll hold till morning," he said. He spread his heavy buffalo coat on the floor near the door, rolling it into a pillow. He pointed toward the bed. "You take that. I'll stay here." Her brow creased. No man had ever offered comfort without a price. She shook her head quickly, clutching the flannel shirt. He didn't argue. He just lay down on the floor, back to the wall, one arm resting over his eyes, the rifle within reach. After a long silence, she whispered, "Why?" His voice came steady, almost lost in the crackle of the fire. "Because no one deserves chains." The words hung in the air, heavy and clean. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters. Inside, the silence turned into something else. Not fear, not command, but room. Lynn lay down on the bed, the quilt rough beneath her fingers. She watched the fire until her eyes blurred. Across the room, Garrett's breathing steadied. It wasn't trust yet, but it was the first night in a long time when neither waited for pain to wake them. By dawn, frost rimmed the window. Light crept across the floorboards, finding the rifle by the door and the empty bowl on the table. Outside, Red Willow kept trading what men could own. Inside, something else had begun. Not ownership, not death. Only the first fragile act of staying. Morning didn't arrive so much as gather itself along the floorboards. Garrett was already awake, eyes on the pale seam of the horizon. Lynn sat up to the sound of water tipping into a tin cup, not boots or iron. "Morning," he said. The house answered with quiet instead of echo. She lifted a hand, not quite a wave, not quite a shield. He poured water from the jug into a tin cup and set it on the table. When she reached for it, he stepped back a pace, making room as if space itself were a gift. "Breakfast," he added. "Beans again. And coffee strong enough to scrape the tongue clean." He didn't apologize for plain food. Plain food kept Bones from whispering too loud about hunger. They ate facing the stove. He finished first but remained seated, letting the quiet turn from awkward to ordinary. When she laid the spoon down, he nodded toward the door. "Come outside," he said. She paused, then rose. Outside, the morning air bit her feet through the wool socks. She flinched, and he noticed. He disappeared inside and returned with a pair of smaller boots. "Try these," he said. She looked at the boots like a puzzle, then slid them on. She stood in the yard, the land spread out in all directions, white snow bowed by wind. Lynn drew a breath so deep it surprised her. The air tasted of ice and pine. She turned her face toward the light, then kneeled and pressed her palm to the soil exposed near the porch. Not a prayer anyone would recognize, only a touch that said the earth still remembered her. Garrett pointed with his chin toward the barn. "We start there." He didn't list rules. He didn't say what she owed. He showed her where the feed was kept, how to scatter grain for the hens, how to check the water trough. She watched his hands, not his mouth. When he lifted a log and his shoulder seized, she caught the flinch he tried to hide. "Old wound," he said. She nodded. The nod wasn't pity, it was a marker on the map they were drawing between them. He handed her a small hatchet. "Split that one," he said. He stood close enough to correct a mistake, but far enough to let the mistake happen without shame. Her first swing glanced off. She reset the log, moved her feet, and brought the blade down. The wood opened with a sharp report. She straightened, and something small in her shoulders lifted. "Good," he said, and didn't smile until she looked away. They worked in that rhythm, show, attempt, adjust, until sweat warmed her under the heavy coat and the frost burned off the fence rails. She learned the weight of the hammer, the patience of wire, the way nails find the straight edge if your hand is steady. He learned the cadence of her silence. When the last rail was braced for the day, he stepped back. "Hold," he said, and passed her a length of wire. Their hands missed twice, touched once, then found the wires pulled together. He didn't look at the touch. Neither did she. The wire held. Around mid-morning, a wagon creaked along the far road, throwing a small cloud of snow. Lynn's body stiffened, eyes locked on the moving shape. Garrett stepped between her and the road, casual enough not to make it worse, deliberate enough to make it better. He rested a hand near his holster. The wagon rolled past without turning in. The moment stretched, then snapped. "No one touches you here," Garrett said, not looking at her. It was a promise that wore plain clothes. They went back inside when the wind rose. He boiled coffee. On the table lay the strip of cloth she had used to wipe her wrists. The skin was less angry now. She picked up the cloth and folded it. "May I?" she asked, the English surprising them both. He nodded. She came near and wrapped his shoulder through the shirt, where the muscle strained. Her fingers worked with a care that refused to call itself tenderness. When she tied the knot, he tested the lift of his arm. "Better," he said. She stepped back. He put on his canvas work coat and handed her another, smaller one. "Yours," he said. She slid into it. The coat was heavy, the way belonging is heavy when you first put it on. She tugged the sleeves up. The coat changed her posture. It moved her from rescued to resident. He took her out again to the yard. "Show you the ridge," he said. They climbed the slope behind the barn. From there, the cabin looked like something a stubborn man would build, square-shouldered and plain. "Watch from here if I'm gone," he said. "Dust line riders. Take the stove for cover inside." She repeated the words, building bones around courage. "Stove for cover." "Yes." Back at the corral, he showed her the halter knots that don't slip. He didn't touch her hands to correct them. He tied one alongside her, then cut his knot open so she could tie it herself. The third attempt held true. "You'll need that," he said. She looked at the rope, then at the dirt. "I know rope," she said, meaning the old kind. He understood. He put the rope away like a word you use carefully. They ate a noon meal that didn't quite deserve the name, a jerky, the heel of yesterday's bread. In the afternoon, he worked at the north fence line where the wind hit hardest. She carried nails in a small leather pouch, handed them one by one. Metal met wood with the clean sound of something agreeing with itself. Toward the middle of the work, she stopped and walked a few steps to the base of a red willow sapling near the fence. She took from her pocket a tiny thing, a jade bead, bone white mixed with green. A piece of the life she had been stolen from. She pressed it into the soil and smoothed the surface with her palm. He didn't ask. Some acts speak clearer when left alone. Clouds gathered. The wind had the cold bite that says evening will not be kind. They finished the last board. Inside, she stirred the pot while he split kindling. When the potatoes were ready, she salted them in her palm and sprinkled it from high, so the salt fell like snow. After they ate, he checked the rifle, then laid it back by the door in plain sight. He wanted her to see readiness was not the same as fear. He pulled a second blanket from the trunk and tossed it onto the bed. "Cold tonight," he said. She looked from the blanket to the floor, then back to him. Her eyes asked a question with trust. "Floor's fine," he said. She held his gaze, then pointed. "Bed. Floor. Him." Then the space beside her on the mattress, a small gesture drawn in the air. "Careful. Deliberate." She left a space, not an invitation to cross, but an acknowledgement that the door had two sides. He stared a beat too long, then shook his head once. The kind of refusal that contained respect. "Not yet," he said. That yet was a bridge built from a single plank. Night fell fast. The storm began as a moan of cold air dragging itself across the hills. The cabin held. Lynn sat with her back to the bedpost. He took the chair, the rifle within reach. "You bought me," she said, words picked carefully. "Then you buried the rope." He stared at the stove. I paid to enterprise. That's all. She waited. Men take what they can, he went on. I've been one of those men. Not like them, he nodded toward town. Different uniform. Same noise in the head. She watched him. War. War, he said. I came home to nothing that looked like home. She nodded. Once, I had home, she said, and touching her chest then opening outward. I had words. She let the hand fall. They let the stove answer for a while. He stood and peeled his shirt away from his shoulder, just enough for her to see the puckered seam of the old wound. She didn't move toward it. She only looked, and then met his eyes, saying without saying, I see the thing that shaped you. He pulled the shirt back on. You stay as long as you want, he said. If there's somewhere else, I stay, she said. The words surprised her with their certainty. They surprised him with how much room they made in his ribcage. He nodded. He stood and banked the fire. Good night, he said. She answered in her language first, then in his. Good night. The storm thinned toward midnight. In the space between the bed and the door, between the one who had been owned and the one who had helped unwrite it, a new truth began to take shape. Not safety exactly. Not yet. But shelter. By morning, there would be more work. A nail would split a board and need replacing. But when the first light fingered the floorboards, it would find 2 coats hanging on the wall instead of 1. Red Willow, Montana Territory. Early winter, 1883. The frost came early that year, singing underfoot like breaking glass. Garrett woke before sunrise, checked the stove, then stepped outside. He could see his breath and the long road that cut through the valley. Inside, Lynn stirred the fire to life. She had learned the rhythm of this place. The cabin had become a heartbeat she could trust. But that morning, the sound on the road didn't belong to safety. It was the slow, measured crunch of wagon wheels over frozen dirt. Garrett heard it first. He looked toward the ridge and saw a dark shape moving against the dawn. A wagon, 2 horses, and 3 men. He called through the open door. Stay inside. Lynn stepped to the window. Who? He didn't need to answer. It was someone who believed ownership was the same thing as order. The wagon pulled up. The man in front wore a black coat and a deputy's badge. Beside him sat a merchant with soft hands. The third was just muscle. Morning, Mr. Thorne, Deputy Hatcher said, his tone friendly in the way snakes are smooth. Word in town says you bought yourself property that wasn't for sale. Garrett wiped his hands on his coat. Don't own property, he said. That's the trouble, the merchant, Mr. Finch, cut in. The girl. Chinese stock belonging to a holding company out of San Francisco. Paper says she was indentured labor. You can't just walk off with assets. Garrett looked at him. You calling a person an asset? That's the term on record. Lynn stepped into the doorway. Her hair was tied back, her face calm but pale against the cold. The merchant pointed. That's her. Garrett didn't turn. You'd best put that hand down, he said, voice level. The finger lowered. The deputy cleared his throat. Now, I'm sure we can settle this. You turn her over, no harm done. Garrett's eyes moved to the fence line. This land's mine, he said. Fence runs true. Nobody crosses it without an invite. The deputy smiled. Law says. The law's a long way from here, Garrett said. The air froze harder than the ground. The merchant shifted. We'll come back with a warrant. Do that, Garrett said. Bring a judge who still remembers the word man. The deputy looked past Garrett to the figure in the doorway. You can speak for yourself. You want to stay with this man. The question hung between them like a drawn blade. Lynn's eyes flicked from the deputy to Garrett, to the man who hadn't touched her since that first day, who had built fences wide enough for trust to breathe inside. She stepped off the threshold, boots crunching frost, and walked until she stood at Garrett's side. "I stay," she said. The deputy opened his mouth, but her tone stopped him. It wasn't defiance shouted, it was truth. "I stay here," she repeated. "No one owns me." Garrett didn't move. The words did more than any rifle could. The merchant muttered, turned the reins, and pulled the horses around. The deputy lingered a second longer, then spat into the dirt. "You just bought yourself trouble, Thorne." "Already paid," Garrett said. The wagon rolled away, leaving tracks like scars in the frost. Lynn stood watching until they disappeared. Her hands trembled, not from fear but from the sudden release of it. Garrett reached for his gloves. "You spoke good," he said. She looked at him. "I spoke true." He nodded, then bent to check the fence rail nearest the road, as though fixing what men had touched could make the morning right again. She joined him without a word. When they finished, she stood and pressed her palm flat against the wood. "This fence," she said. "Not to keep me in." "No," Garrett said. "To keep the world out." That evening, the cabin smelled of coffee and smoke. Lynn sat near the window sewing a tear in her coat. Garrett cleaned the rifle. When she finished sewing, she spoke without looking up. "They will come again." He exhaled. "Maybe. Maybe not. Men like that depend on how bored the world gets." She nodded. "If they come, I stand with you." He smiled, just a corner of his mouth. "You already did." Outside, the last light of day faded. The air smelled of snow. Garrett went to the door and looked out. The fence gleamed silver. Every board straight. He closed the door softly and slid the bolt into place. Inside, the warmth held steady. The house no longer echoed. It sounded lived in. Red Willow, Montana Territory. Late winter, 1883. Snow fell quiet that morning, soft enough to hear it land. Lynn stood on the porch, wrapped in Garrett's coat, watching the flakes melt against her hands. The ranch below lay still. Smoke curled from the chimney. Behind her, Garrett poured coffee. "Fence won't last till spring," he said. "Then we build again," she answered. They stood side by side, steam rising between them. The silence no longer felt hollow. It had weight. Warmth. It had been months since the men came. None had returned. Peace had grown in the shape of ordinary days, fixing rails, baking bread. Lynn laughed sometimes now, the sound brief but real. That afternoon, he brought a small package from town. A silver locket, plain and empty. "No picture," he said. Didn't seem right to choose one. Lynn turned it in her palm. "Then it waits," she said. "For something that belongs." They ate supper by lamplight. Outside, the wind softened. Garrett watched her hands move, steady and certain, and thought of the auction square, of 6 silver coins falling like thunder. He'd bought freedom for a stranger and found something harder to name. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked. She looked up, eyes calm. "I think about before," she said. "But before is gone." "And after?" "After is here." He nodded. That was enough. When dawn returned, the frost had melted from the windows. Lynn stepped outside, pressed her palm to the young red willow she'd planted. Its branches shivered in the wind, thin but alive. "Grow," she whispered. "For both of us." Behind her, Garrett called. "Coffee's ready." She turned, smiling faintly. "Sweet." Lifted the tin pot. Brought sugar this time. They stood in the doorway, sharing warmth and quiet. No vows. No grand ending. Just 2 people who had stopped running. Outside, the earth thawed under the snow, learning to breathe again. Inside, the fire burned low but steady. And somewhere beneath the frost, the buried rope slept quiet. Lynn watched the horizon brighten, the first light brushing gold across the fence line. The world looked fragile and new, pausing before the next beginning. Garrett lifted his cup, eyes tracing the same hills, and for a moment neither spoke. There was nothing left that needed saying. The wind moved through the red willow, whispering softly in a language both of them almost understood. She closed the door halfway, keeping the warmth inside. The day would start soon. But for now, they stood unowned, unbound, quietly alive.